I've been involved in digital health for quite a long time, and I've been involved in digital and non-digital service design. And at the core of whatever I do, I always place what is the patient outcome that I'm looking for? How do you build a service? How do you build a system so that the patient is at the center of it? And that has been a unifying force in whatever I've been involved in. And what I could see about Thalamos right from the very earlier stages of meeting Arden and Ross is that they had a similar value set to the one I had. And I've worked in places where that's not the case, and I am in the position where I can choose who I work with. And that's what really drew me to working with them. So I knew about some of the work that had gone on, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic around video consultations, for example. And I knew that Thalamos's approach had been to take people with lived experience, like Steve Gilbert's experience, very, very seriously, and that featured within their decision making at a really quite a fundamental level. And that's not something in my experience, I have always come across. For me, understanding what responsible innovation is very much comes to how people are making those decisions on a day-to-day basis. So that's what really drew me to working with them in the first place.
Well, do you have a particular ethos when it comes to clinical safety and responsible revision? Do you have a kind of Leah's ethos?
It's really about not separating out clinical safety from what we do as clinicians every day, which is actually patient safety. So there are these two concepts of clinical safety and patient safety. Clinical safety has come to be something that is talking specifically about risk mitigation around digital technology. So started out really from devices, everything from ventilators to cardiac monitors, and this concept of, you know, what are the regulations that you have to adhere to in terms of clinical safety, and there are specific regulations that we have to meet and certain things that we have to do. That's actually quite different from the much broader picture of patient safety. Patient safety exists across the whole of healthcare practice, and is much more about what are all the factors at play when there is a clinician-patient interaction. What are all the systems? What are all the technologies? What are all the people doing within that system? And how do we approach that in order to be constantly improving patient outcomes? So it's keeping the patient safe, but also doing the best that we can to make sure that they recover, because that's what we're here to do. My approach to clinical safety is to sit it very firmly within that wider patient safety piece. And that also means thinking about something called clinical governance. And in terms of clinical governance, it's really sort of our quality assurance in healthcare. That's the way I think about what clinical governance is. So say, for example, if I am thinking about designing a whole service in the NHS, the first thing I would have to do is think about what are our clinical governance aims. And there are various frameworks you can use for that. Ones that I've used before are things like there's a particular clinical governance framework that's published in the BMJ. I can find the article for that, so I can give you the better tagline of what that's actually called. But it sort of divides down. There are various ways of dividing down clinical governance into key domains and making sure that whatever service you're designing and, you know, whatever business you're setting up actually meets all of those criteria, and is thinking about what we need to do in each of those areas. And there are ethical principles underpinning all of those different areas. And again, that clinical safety should sit within that. It shouldn't be any different to doing any other kind of service design. And we don't think about that enough in the industry, in my opinion. And it's, again, when you asked me about what things drew me to working with Thalamos, was that even without knowing necessarily all that kind of clinical governance framework, which very much comes from a clinical service development perspective, without knowing that, Thalamos were talking about things that fit within those categories. And so I saw an opportunity to take that approach that I've always taken in my work and to think about, well, how do you get the technology to fit within that clinical governance framework, which does the best for clinicians, patients, everyone involved in that interaction with that system, how do you build a system that by design is thinking about those things? Too often we have a problem that's raised and people think about a technological solution and they just try to solve the problem without thinking, what is the clinical governance framework that we are addressing here? And how do we make sure we design the system so from the start it is more likely to meet those aims? Clinical safety is very often at the moment done as an after the fact checkbox exercise. And actually we know from patient safety, it's a similar sort of thing in patient safety. There's been that journey of learning really over the past few years, that's just not good enough. It's not good enough to come after the event and try and reverse engineer it. You need to be thinking about this up front. That's why there's so much work in the patient safety field about looking at things like human factors and thinking about what are the behaviors that we're trying to encourage people to use that lead to safe outcomes and best quality of care outcomes.
If I can pick up there, so when we started working with you, I think one of the challenges that I articulated to you, or probably more appropriate, Ross articulated to you, is that the clinical safety frameworks that we were expected to adhere to were actually quite challenging to adhere to for a modern software company, because they've been built, a bit like you said, for kind of after the fact. So you build a piece of software and it then goes through a clinical safety review and you check all the possible outcomes of that software, and then you're allowed to subsequently deploy it for use with patients. But that's quite a waterfall type development process, and that goes against kind of modern software development practices of being agile and iterating and constantly improving. And so the challenge we were having was, how do we meet a standard that is supposed to be a defined moment in time, when actually we release something every 2 weeks? So in theory, we should reassess the entire solution every 2 weeks. Well, then you would just be in a constant clinical safety assessment and never actually get anything out there. So I think that was the challenge we articulated to you at the beginning, and that we've been trying to grapple with. How do you feel we're kind of getting on in that approach? Is that something, do you recall those conversations, and how do you think we're getting on in trying to tackle that challenge?
Yeah, definitely recall it. I mean, I think it's fundamental to my job in Thalamos, and it's what I've seen evolving over time, and fortunately been able to influence the way that evolves. So very much, as you say, Arden, it's bringing in that dynamic, agile approach to clinical safety that is already there in the way the technology is being developed, and modifying the systems, the technological systems, so that it can meet those aims of constantly thinking about what the clinical safety requirements are. And for me, that means embedding a culture of clinical safety. So that means everybody in the business needs to understand what the purpose is. Why does a developer in one place need to understand what the outcome of maybe some quality assurance testing or a bit of code that they're pushing? Why is it important to understand what the clinical consequences are? Because it will feed into their everyday decision making. Literally each time they're thinking about pushing some code, or the quality assurance testers are thinking about what testing they're doing, they have the bigger picture in mind, and they can understand how that connects to what the output is. And that's really, really important, because where you get errors, where you get patient safety problems coming up, and I'm particularly using patient safety problems because this is again something we've seen from the patient safety world, is when all the people within the system don't have the overview of what's going on. That's where it becomes really difficult, because we're talking about complex systems and complex behaviors, and one behavior over here in pushing code affects the output behavior of the clinician, for example, using the system at the other end. And so if you don't understand why a particular piece of design or a particular way a system works impacts the way somebody is making a clinical decision at the end, there's no way you can mitigate that up front. And all you end up doing is end up storing that up and producing this big issue, which is actually much more difficult to solve when you're doing it after the fact. So moving that assessment up the product development cycle allows us to think in advance as a team, and this is very much a team approach, is to think about, okay, for example, I've had a really good conversation with Daniel, our head of engineering, and I understand what Daniel's trying to do with the architecture of the platform and building in that clinical safety thinking across all the parts of the system, which not always you would think about the engineering teams as having to think that through. But that would be, you know, if you take the approach to safety, for example, in the airplane industry, which is, you know, is the classic place where we have taken some learning from in patient safety, there would be no way that you couldn't think about the consequence of a decision that's made about a particular algorithm or the way a particular piece of technology works. If you don't think about the consequence of that up front while you're designing that, it's highly likely that that's going to, or much more likely that that's going to lead to a problem that leads to the plane dropping out of the sky. And for me, it's absolutely the same. You have to push all of that approach up the line in product development cycle, which ends up reducing, it spreads the work out across the whole cycle and overall reduces the amount of work that actually has to be done around the edge. We are able to respond much more quickly because we're picking things up. So I have tangible examples of the way we've been doing that with you know, certain products that we're developing, that well before we get anywhere near any coding being done, that we you know, worked through workflows and identified, okay, if that is designed like that, that is going to influence the way the end user is making a decision. We need to modify that now before that gets hardwired into code, because that's going to, we're still going to need to test that, but that is going to make a fundamental difference to how easy it is to mitigate any risks from that particular decision. So I see very much that kind of agile dynamic approach to clinical safety starting to be solved by pushing the decision making up the line in terms of the product cycle and introducing as much design thinking as we can throughout that product life cycle. And the third bit is connecting up all parts of the team so that we are all aligned on the same thing. We understand why Leah and Ian and Ross doing their clinical safety, you know, thinking about the clinical safety, why our thinking fits that way and matches with what Daniel and the engineering teams are doing with the decisions they're making on an everyday business. So that communication is absolutely key.
Thanks, Claire. Whether with me or with others in the team or with external stakeholders, what have the challenges been for you in trying to achieve your, again, clinical safety, patient safety aspirations? What do you think have been the big hurdles that we've had to get?
I think people often underestimate the complexity of the system, and they often underestimate, they sort of think something is an easy fix, like even just down to digitizing forms. People don't necessarily understand how complex the whole system is, and that you're not just digitizing a form. This is about changing the way a whole system works. And within that, you have people who are behaving in a certain way, and you need to understand as much as you can about those people's behaviors in order to be able to design a system that provides the safest best practice care. And being able to communicate the complexity of that, but giving people a way to deal with it, I see as fundamental to our job, actually. So in some ways it's the biggest barrier, but it's also the bit that I get quite excited about. It's the challenge, actually. And I think we're very well set up in Thalamos because of the lines of communication we've got. And we start from a good place of being aligned on value set that allows us to take that challenge and run with it. So it's there's a good quote somewhere from somebody that I'll find that I had in one of my talks, which is about seeing the opportunity, seeing the challenge as the opportunity. And that is very, very true in digital. And for me, that's where the success comes from, is where you're able to take those challenges and you turn them into opportunities to build beautiful systems.
So we do a lot of things by steering group. We try and engage a lot of stakeholders. So we have the Thalamos steering group, which is a multi-stakeholder group. So you've got you, Steve Gilbert from Lived Experience, Debbie Martin is AMP lead, Ian and James Reed as well from NHS leadership and junior doctor representation. So we've got that steering group who are trying to keep us kind of grounded from as an organisation, as Thalamos, you know, the company, and make sure that we're ethically and clinically grounded. But from a product perspective, we've also got steering groups that come and look at the AMP perspective, the mental health lead perspective, the doctor perspective as well. And we deliberately silo those so that we're getting three kind of uncompromised perspectives. How do you see that we those safety and responsible innovation perspective? Because obviously doctors want certain things, social services want certain things, and the kind of mental health act legal teams often have to be the kind of referees of the whole local system. And there is a bit of friction there. And obviously once we put things down into technology, there's actually not a lot of wriggle room or opportunity to fudge things. So how do you see clinical safety having a role in balancing those sometimes misaligned objectives of the stakeholders?
So I think the role of clinical safety there is to keep everyone grounded on the outcome being the best outcome for the patient. And it's marrying up what is required, you know, what is the statutory requirement? What are the things that, you know, nobody can argue with, and the statutory requirements, and then continuing to put the patient at the center of what it is that we're doing, because that's what unites all those different groups. That's what they're trying to do. Each one of them is trying to do their job so that the patient gets the best outcome. And keeping that in mind, and also, but keeping a priority on all the users in the system, understanding that they all orbit, if you like, around the patient around the patient outcome, is where I think clinical safety needs to keep everyone focused on that, so that we optimize, for example, say the AMP user flow is optimized so that we're getting the best patient safety outcomes, and that we optimize the police workflow or the doctor's workflow, taking all of those different perspectives and making sure that whatever design decision made, or technological decisions that are made, are focused around taking all of those perspectives and aligning them around what is the clinical safety objective for the patient out, people together around that. And that's very much, it's a very tricky job to do, but that is very much where the strength in the product design is, because we're having to integrate those perspectives to get those outcomes for the patient, and keeping everyone aligned on that. This is where use of the scoring, we use scoring mechanisms to look at risks and identify what risks are and the size and scale of the risk. Putting some numbers around that can really help shape people's thinking. So if we're able to say, you know, go back to the AMP and say, okay, understand why you need this workflow to look like this, but this needs to integrate with this workflow coming in from the doctors who are, you know, working on a particular form. And if we need to come to an agreement as to how to make that work as seamlessly as we can in order to maximize the patient outcome here. And that's what I think is the role of the sort of product clinical safety aspect, is making sure we keep centered on that. And I think we haven't talked about the kind of ethical underpinnings of what we do, but what we're trying to do with our clinical safety strategy in Thalamos is use the ethical principles from the Mental Health Act review in order to again, give some framework for guiding those decisions where there might be a difference of opinion around things. How do we make sure that a design decision or a product decision satisfies the AMPs and the doctors, and maintains the patient outcome? Where there's anything contentious, we take it back to the Mental Health Act review principles. Is this protecting autonomy, for example? And we've got quite a nice set of ethical principles there that allows us to guide the way that product is being developed.
That's awesome. It also kind of leads me on to my next question, really, which is we've now, or I feel that we've now reached a kind of, I think it's officially we call it version 2, but we've reached a standard of clinical safety where we are comfortable that we are executing it at the beginning of the process in an efficient way and a way that we in the team understand. And I think now there's lots of gains we can still make there, and I think there's lots of learning still for us to take, but they're starting to become marginal. They're starting to, we're starting to just refine things a bit and make them just gently better and better. For me, the next step is, okay, how do we take what we've done there with clinical safety, which was at least to some degree a codified approach. We felt that it was too after the event, but at least there was kind of standards there that we could follow and use to guide us. The next question for me is, how do we take that framework and apply it to the other aspects of what we're doing, which is lived experience by design. Mental health care brings in a lot of lived experience, but some do it well, some do it less well. Some people view it as a bit of a tick box. Some people view it as kind of necessary evil in some instances, and some advocacy groups view it as a quite combative exercise to go after clinicians and providers. We don't want any of those things. What we want to do is use lived experience perspective to guide our decision making, because if it does guide our decision making, we will make better decisions, because everybody is saying the patient is at the middle, but you're not going to know what they think unless you talk to them. So we want to do that, and we would like to create a framework of, like I say, lived experience by design as well, but that hasn't existed before. So I suppose my question there is, where do you see this kind of bigger ethics by design piece, lived experience by design, evolving from our kind of base of now having a process for clinical safety? And what, second question to that is, what do you think the opportunities of doing so are?
Oh, I think the opportunities of doing that are huge. And you talk about reasons why I want to work with Thalamos. That's very exciting to be able to have the remit to be able to look at that. So I think in very practical terms, there are things that we're already starting to do and we can do more of. For example, taking each of those 4 principles from the Mental Health Act review, we can take each of those domains and we can look at how our product is delivering or not delivering on that. And then what I would want us to do, which we are already doing this, is this came out in, before I even joined Thalamos, and things like decision around video consultations. You're taking the perspectives of all of those people that we have involved in Thalamos, and coming together and making decisions, real hardcore everyday decisions about what features go in, what features don't go in, how do we approach a particular piece of work, and putting that together and seeing whether that approach that comes from that team perspective, is it delivering on those 4 ethical principles in the Mental Health Act review. That's quite a tangible way of seeing, are we doing what we're saying we're doing? So I imagine us down the line being able to start doing quality improvement work. So studies that look at, okay, the way we've approached a particular piece of work, for example, with one of our customers, what are the quality improvements that you have gained by using the system? Are there particular, and we are already thinking about this in the design of the system, has this led to improvements in, for example, the speed with which processes are being carried out? Have we managed to show that people are getting better decisions made, they're getting better quality care because we've taken away some of that administrative burden? Have we done that in the best way that we can? Have we presented back the information in a way that optimizes the decision maker of the end user? These are all things that we can look at over time, and because we're thinking about it up front, we can put in place the things that we need to in order to be able to have that data available for us to look at over time. And we are iteratively looking at that as well. So again, it's not just about doing this at an endpoint somewhere down the line. It's actually having this thinking as we're doing it. I know that we are talking about this now, thinking about with the next piece of work we're doing, what is the data they're going to need? What are the quality improvement aspects that, you know, a particular customer is going to want to look at? Are we making sure that this is accessible within the sort of data that we're collecting for that end user to be able to come back and improve on that design? This isn't a finished piece, it's constantly improving and needs to constantly develop.
So clearly, part of my job is to make sure that we balance all the competing considerations of an organisation. And we're a commercial organisation. We're a for-profit, for-purpose business, but those words are not mutually exclusive. We have to deliver our purpose, but we also have to make a profit. Otherwise, we cease to be an entity. So there are things that we have to consider commercially, and often those things can come first in private enterprise, whereas for us we try and balance them, and sometimes they're net positive and sometimes they compete a little bit. With your kind of clinical safety and ethics by design and responsible innovation hats on, how do you see balancing those from your side, particularly when, you know, you have to tell me that I need to do something that's not necessarily going to make me money, it's probably going to cost me money?
Well, they're not mutually exclusive, are they? Because we're talking about a complicated system, and in order to be able to produce the best complicated system you can, it is entirely possible to have the best value system that is also the highest quality of care. And I think, again, this is another one of these things that for me is an absolute opportunity, because when it's thought through well, it is hugely powerful. You don't have to have just by incorporating design thinking and thinking about the clinical governance side of what you're trying to do, means that your product is going to be the highest quality that it can, and you align that to it giving the highest quality care that it can. And that is not mutually exclusive to having the best value care that you can. The two things are not separated. And I think there sometimes can be quite, I would call it quite an immature approach to that, where there's an assumption that the cheapest thing is the best thing. But actually, you can produce cost savings within a system and still deliver high quality care. And digital actually affords you the ability to do that. But we need to embed the values in the system right from the start. I think, well, so one of the things that we've started to do, and I want us to do more of, is thinking about, you know, for example, features that we might be needing to build in, is to be thinking them both from a number of different perspectives. What's the technological cost? What's the commercial, what's the word? What's the technological proposition? What is the commercial proposition? What is the clinical safety proposition here? What is the clinical governance proposition here? And looking at all of those in the round every time you do something right from the beginning. And that is very different to the way some things are built and not considered from all of those different perspectives. So we talk about, I've worked for different companies which talk about being clinically led or talk about being commercially led. And actually what you need is a confluence of all those things. You need to be thinking about product, you need to be thinking about commercial, you need to be thinking about clinical, and you need to be thinking about process and project within that. So that is the approach, where we talk about the communication being good across Thalamos. That works, and you get the best system when you do that in that joined up way.
I'd agree with that. We had one trust that we were working with that had 0 amends required on our forms. So these are paper forms. They're very, well, historically they were paper forms. They're very prone to error. And we knew that we were reducing errors. That was the point of the software, but we hadn't realized that we were in a position where we could reduce those to 0. And I think that comes from really thinking through how and who is going to be using our software and in what scenarios they're going to be using it in. We are not dealing with a lot of people who are sat at a desk and who are digital natives. People using our software are people who are used to interacting with people. They spend all their time talking to patients, to others. They do that in a hospital environment. They do that in a community setting. They could be doing that in a police station. They could be doing that in a whole host of different settings with different environments. And they don't care about our software, and neither should they. They should be caring about supporting their patient and doing what's in the best interest of them. And we're there to try and enable that in the lowest friction way and safest way possible. If they're thinking about how to use Thalamos, then we've got it wrong and we need to figure out how to improve it. They should be thinking about how to help their patient and do what's in the best interest of them, and they just happen to be using a tool. I almost want them not to notice us, but obviously commercially I'd quite like them to sing our praises. But you know, we want to be seamless and easy to use so that they can focus their energies on what they should be doing, not figuring out their way around a software. And I think, again, as Leah says, that starts by bringing that all in at the beginning and testing and being open to feedback. Like it is a creative process, and through any creative process, when you show somebody your work and say, look at this nice thing I've done, and they tell you all the things that they don't like about it, that can be a bit demoralizing. But actually, we have to realize that that is an integral part of the process. When they say, they're not saying it for negative reasons, because there's a high degree of trust and we share all the same values. They're saying it because they know that we can be better, and we have to be comfortable and open to that. And I think we are. You know, we take feedback well, and we act on it.
Yeah, I think just exactly as Arden said, if we are succeeding, people won't notice us, and it will be intuitive, and that's the, you know, that's the goal, really.
And safe, you know, and it just you know, you just start to notice those things, and that's where I think the quality improvement work comes in. Is where we can start to prove those points in a more scientific way, so that they can have confidence in what they're doing. And I think comfort and confidence in a new process has got to be the goal, really, because then you're not worrying about it. You've got other things to expend that energy.
Where I think you know, what's really exciting about what Thalamos are doing, it's not just making it intuitive for how people are working now. We're also in the position where we're starting to be able to encourage better practice in the clinicians. And that comes back to embedding the product design in those ethical principles, because if we are starting to understand the way clinicians are currently operating within the Mental Health Act, and understanding where that is not serving patients well, and where the touch points are that we can try and improve that, and embedding that within those Mental Health Act four principles, that's really exciting, because we're not just making what's currently there work well, we're actually being able to improve practice overall. That's super exciting and super amazing for patients.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And actually, something I think we'll pick up with Steve as well later on. The Mental Health Act is actually supposed to be there as a safeguard for patients. It is supposed to be something that stops people at their most vulnerable being mistreated in any way. And that's its objective. However, somehow over the last however many years, it has evolved in the minds of patients into something that feels like it is being done to you, and it feels like the Mental Health Act process is the process, as actually this is a healthcare process with a mental health act safeguard. And that's come back to us consistently from the patient groups we're talking to. And so our role is to try and actually take the Mental Health Act back to the core of what it should be, which is a safeguard that sits behind the scenes, and so that the clinicians involved in looking after somebody are able to look after that person properly. But that sits behind this safeguard that just keeps an eye on everything and makes sure that they're doing things within a framework that is legal and that is definitely in the best interest of the patient. And that's something that Steve pushes us on and resonates with me strongly, is if we can use technology to try and make the Mental Health Act more human, that would be a massive success. It's also totally counterintuitive to any other kind of software. Everybody thinks software is trying to make things more robotic and less human and dehumanizing. Strangely, we seem to have the opportunity to do the opposite here. And that, for me, is quite exciting. If we really can move it back so that it's not all about pink forms and it's not all about detention, and it's back to things like it's just part of the admission process and how you get into hospital. Make sure that that's done properly and in the safe and correct way, and that you're treated in a timely manner. And I'm already talking myself back into those 4 principles from the review of the Mental Health Act. Treating the person as an individual, giving them autonomy, least restrictive option available. Those are the things that we should be trying to use the software to enable. There's a couple of things. So the biggest one to highlight is the use of video assessments. Last year in COVID, everybody kind of went, we want to do video assessments of people who are mentally ill before they go into hospital, or people who are perceived to be mentally ill. We took that to our main steering group and said, what do you think of this? They said, we think it's ethically iffy. They could see the benefits, the pros and cons, incidentally, because your options at that point, some of the options at that point were either approaching somebody who was unwell in full PPE, visor, face mask, gown, everything else, which is for somebody experiencing certain types of mental illness would be very distressing, or through video, which for others is very distressing. So there were lots of considerations there, and they were being debated nationally as well as locally. We took it to our steering group. They said they were ethically uncomfortable with it, so we didn't do it. Subsequently, in January this year, the High Court ruled that any video consultations were unlawful and had to be redone. So that was a big bullet dodged, because we were the different stakeholders right at the beginning. But there's a lot more subtleties to this that I think Leah was kind of touching on earlier on. It's not about dodging the big bullets, because that could have gone one of 2 ways, right? And we were comfortable with the decision that we made and the reasons we made it. What's key is you don't end up with mission creep, where you're accidentally starting to lead clinicians in their decision making and wiring in bias and things like that. And so that, which is a major problem with the Mental Health Act. There's a huge, particularly racial bias to people detained under the Mental Health Act. And we actually are fortunate to have quite a diverse engineering team, but there's lots of stories of bias being hardwired into software. So you've got to think about that. And so what we've established in our process is that we are discussing individual features before, as Leah said, before they've even gone to code. So an example would be, we were working with a large client, shall we say, on a semi-bespoke piece of work. And we have a series of kind of check boxes early on in the process. And one of those is are we making a decision on behalf of somebody else here? Yes or no? And if the answer to that is no, because it's changing the color of a button, for example, I think that's a good, or you could lead somebody there, I guess, if you change it from green to red or the other way around. But, does this feature, does this thing have a chance of influencing a decision or affecting a patient? Yes or no? If the answer to that is no, fine, crack on. If the answer to that is yes, well, actually it has to be discussed at our next clinical safety group. And in one of those examples, it got to Leah and Ian, and rightly they called out and said, well, hang on, you the software are making a decision on behalf of the doctor here, so we can't do that. That's not something we're comfortable with. And so then we went back to the client and said, our clinical safety team have said that they're not comfortable with this. And the client said, oh, well, oh, hang on, actually, no, maybe you are right. You know, and that was helping them to check their own process, because their own brief had started to lead us to lead the doctors. And that's why you've got to have the checks and balances at all levels, because people do miss stuff. And it's just hardwiring those checks in that I think helps us dodge the day-to-day bullets rather than just the big, you know, headlines. Leah, would you concur with that?
I would, and that's a nice example, because in that example, it's highlighting what the regulation does and doesn't allow us to do. So the kind of bare bones of clinical safety of what we are and allowed, not allowed to do, let alone what we want to do with the product. But then in that particular case, we still have that data available actually about those decisions that might be made. And there are other ways that we can present that back to encourage the right decision to be made, or at least for that data to be looked at. What Arden's talked about, there being huge problems around people from Black and minority ethnic groups being detained at much higher rates than other people. And if we have the data to be able to look at that decision making, we can start, the wider system can start to understand why those decisions are being made and what measures can we put in place to help clinicians understand when those biases are creeping in and to try and mitigate them. And this is from but this requires quite a deep understanding of the system, what the factors are, what the technology can and can't do, and how we help the system do the best for the patient in those circumstances.